Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our conversation today. My name is Myles Markham. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns. I am a transmasculine, non binary person. I identify as queer and Christian, and I was born and raised in small towns around the Deep South. So the themes from Proper Pronouns are all ones that were very easy for me to identify with. Joining me here today is the director and co-editor of Proper Pronouns, Meg Daniels. Meg is an award-winning photographer and researcher, and we all just had the distinguished privilege of watching her feature film debut. Meg, thank you for joining us, and thank you for all of the time, effort, love, and energy you put into this project. Before we jump into some questions for you, I just wanted to remind everyone watching that all of our screenings through Southern Circuit are funded in part by a grant from South Arts, a regional arts organization in partnership with the National Endowment for the Arts. If anybody wants more information about Southern Circuit and South Arts, please visit southarts.org/Southern Circuit. With that being said, let's jump in, Meg. I love the film first and foremost. So again, thank you for bringing it to be. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about bringing it to be. What's the genesis story of Proper Pronouns?
I too would like to thank everyone briefly. I am, because proper pronouns are so important, I identify as she, hers. And I want to thank everyone at South Arts and all the volunteers, the organization, for inviting me to be a part of such an important, poignant event in the film industry. I was just so excited to find out in August that my co-producer and I, Manny Robinson, made it to this. He's also my co-editor, Manny Robinson. We made it to one of the best homes for a film possible, in my opinion, as far as impact and outreach. So this was really where we wanted it to live. This is the best home, in my opinion. In 2016, I started my first year short at Wake Forest University, and it was about a friend of mine whose daughter was transitioning, and I wanted it to be through the eyes of a mother. And we got going through November. We started shooting in September and went through November, and all of a sudden, they decided this project was not good for them anymore. And they decided to, gracefully back out. And I completely understood. It was a very emotional time for them. And I had done so much work on the project already that I wanted to continue with a story about, the trans community. I, being from New York, I could not wrap my head around how parents in the South would just, exonerate their children if they came out as part of the LGBTQ community. I have family members and best friends that came out and when we were growing up. And although there were difficult times, there were periods of silence between them, they never, ever kicked their children out of the family. And I just could not wrap my head around that. So I wanted to continue with this project. And we found Liam. He was one of the first trans men to graduate from the divinity program at Wake Forest University. It was a huge deal. Unfortunately, the college, although, it did have Baptist roots, it was originally a plantation. And so they kind of played this up a little too much and kind of took bragging rights. But it was a huge accomplishment for Liam. He's so intelligent, as everyone can see. He's so philosophical. So it was a really huge deal. And he was my first 10-minute or my first year film that was 10 minutes long. And it was just about Liam. And then Manny came on board and we decided to do our thesis film over the course of the next 2 years on the four of them. We were not sure exactly what we wanted to do. And I asked Manny, because we had so many layers of an onion to peel back, I asked him if he'd be willing to continue working on this project, because we felt we had to bring in trans people of color. And, we fell in love with Dawn also. She was one of the second ones we met. And she just, as everybody can see, although she's very deeply emotional at times, she's so funny. So we fell in love with the other three, and it was extremely important to bring them in. And that's how the ball got rolling.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. That reminds me of a question I will come to later. So we'll circle back. But I'm immediately thinking of this one theme in documentary filmmaking, and that's of authentic authorship. Asking the question of who is telling the stories, that we're all getting to watch. And so I'm wondering if you would share with our audience what your approach was to amplifying the voices of people and a community that you may not be directly a part of, but are in solidarity with.
That's a great question. And we've been asked that multiple times. And it started in the classroom with our professors. They said, you have to be ready to answer the question, why do you feel, as a white cisgender woman with privilege because of your skin color, do you have the honor, or why should you be given the honor of telling the stories of community that you are not a part of? Why would they trust you? It's almost something that I didn't go in thinking that. I went in thinking, let me be the linchpin. Let me be a platform for them. I didn't take any of the other things into consideration, just because it's not that I'm oblivious, of course, to my white privilege. And that's not a financial thing. That's just white privilege as part of this wonderful caste system that we still exist in. And that I had to take that with me to every interview. And every time I spent time with them, even in Walmart, I had to take that in consideration, because not only was it about skin color, but it was also about a privilege that I have, part of the mainstream social system that we exist in. Everything that I do as part of humanity is easily accepted. Now, that's not to say I don't ruffle feathers and I make people mad, but everything that I do, just existing in life, is okay in so many ways. Well, the trans folks don't have that privilege, regardless of just skin color. I mean, Michael and Deborah have 3 strikes against them. Dawn has privileges that they don't, and they know that. So every time I went with them anywhere, sat down with them, or thought of the questions, I had to shut up and let them tell their story. It's not my story to tell. So all I did was turn on the camera and try to have genuine conversations with them. You do not pepper trans people with questions about body parts. It's not about body parts. It's about humanity. And I wanted to avoid those conversations. If they came up, if they wanted to talk about them, that was completely up to them. A lot of stuff got left on the cutting room floor because it's not important. There were times that Manny and I both had questions that we had prepared to ask, and we had them on our phones when we were sitting there behind the camera. And I would look at one after a half an hour of conversation, and I would look at him and he would look at me, and we're just like, no way, we cannot ask this question. And as we spent more and more time with them, we realized that they answered a lot of our questions for us before we even asked, because they are so genuine and so willing to share their story. They have nothing to hide anymore, and they don't want to hide, obviously, because they were a part of this film. So we had to learn, as I said, to shut up and let them tell their story and literally just be with them. And it was not difficult at all. Once we learned the role that we have in society and the role that they try to have in society and want to have in society, it became a very fluid conversation. And they respected us for everything that we did and tried to learn and made sure we were extremely careful. We were always willing to learn about the trans community and more about the LGBTQ community in general. They corrected us, and we welcomed that, as should anyone who is spending time with anyone as part of the LGBTQ community. They understood that we genuinely cared. And I think as a filmmaker, regardless of what you're filming, that has to be the primary aspect, as well as ethics. I'm very, very adamant about being ethical, not only as a filmmaker and recreating things. You don't go out and stage things. Recreating things or rephrasing things are different. But, ethically, as a person and as a filmmaker, when it comes to creating content, those are very important to me.
Yeah, thank you. I think that is such a critical lesson, and it's one that I'm actually very happy to hear was introduced, in film school, because I know that the history of documentary includes plenty of approaches, to filmmaking that are not as considerate. And one thing that comes immediately to mind to me is you describe seeing questions that you had to ask and realizing that they were not appropriate, realize that that's not where the conversation needed to go. And I think that is a lesson that some networks might, take on themselves. I think about some of the largest budget kind of docu-series and episodes of shows in the last few years around transgender people. And I believe the journalistic approach was, we're going to ask the question everyone is wondering, taking for granted that many of the questions that everyone wonders are rooted in prejudice, are rooted in discriminatory views of trans communities, are rooted in the obsession with our bodies. And so I, really thank you just personally for being able to really resist, that pattern of content creation, specifically for trans people, and to really focus, on the rich, full, complex, and spiritual lives of our communities. So that means a lot. And I hope that others kind of take that lesson forward into their filmmaking as well. I'd love now to kind of go back to your protagonists and ask kind of this question about, Liam and Deborah and Dawn and Michael. Can you talk a little bit about their particular stories? You mentioned falling in love, with them as characters. And another thing we learn is that there are about 30 openly trans ministers. And so why those 4? I know the geography was important to you, but I'm kind of curious about what it means to take a story you personally find compelling of somebody's life and work in ministry, and transferring that to wider audiences. How does that decision-making and process go?
That's a great question. And I hadn't thought about geography. Geographically, yes, you're correct. It had to take place here, because you can't do the story that we did, in Massachusetts. You can do it, but it would be totally different, right?
Yeah.
Or California, where there is more acceptance. And one of the questions that I had, I personally feel, as I got to know them, that they're tortured on a daily basis for so many reasons, right? And I said, why do you stay? And just like Diana says, Liam's work is here. That was one of her quotes in the film, right? All four of them stay because the impact here is going to be so much more impactful than it might be in another state where they would be more readily accepted. With that in mind, I feel like regardless of where people live when they see this film, audience members can relate in some way. One, I hope that when they are sitting next to someone in a pew, they may realize that they love that person. After seeing this film, I want them to question, okay, I don't know who I'm sitting next to anymore, because they pass, right? And they accept them for who they are. I always want that question to come to mind, because if they love them then, and if they find out who they are in the future, possibly, maybe never, because it isn't anybody's business, that they still sit next to them, he, she, them, in the pew. Because everybody is told, love thy neighbor. Well, then they leave and, oh, that's a trans person. That goes against my religious beliefs. That's not allowed. I can't love them. Well, you loved them 5 seconds ago before you walked out the door, right? So I think in the broader sense, geographically, somehow anyone, regardless if they're part of the trans community or not, it's important to realize that they're surrounded by human beings, and it doesn't matter if you're in California and a minister is trans or not trans, or you re-enter the church as a trans person, because they told us stories. Everyone, the four of them left their churches. Either they were kicked out of their churches, as Dawn was, she was removed as a minister. But also kids, kids really, really struggle if they are, deeply, if religion is very deeply rooted in their lives and they transition, and then the church turns their back on them. It's devastating. And all four of them told us that suicide was very much at the forefront. So I think anyone can relate to this, regardless of what pronouns you have or what belief systems you have. For me, I've come to realize that I'm an atheist. And I used to go into churches and cringe, or synagogues and cringe, because I was raised Catholic. And it was shoved down my throat that, love thy neighbor. And then every Sunday you have to come in and confess how horrible of a person you are. Well, that's kind of not okay. So I realized that even audience members who may be atheists that see this film, right, can now appreciate scripture in a totally different way than they did before. And one of my huge turning points, and as I reflect on it all the time, was Dawn's sermon, "You're not alone in the boat." And and how she talks about how she would look in the mirror and finally not cry. I mean, all of us as human beings have those moments, regardless of pronouns, right? We look in the mirror and we want to cry because of who we were or who we might be, or current, at present, something that we're going through. And I think that it just really gives everyone a chance, no matter where people's roots lie in this world, or where people's roots, where that wasn't grammatically correct, where people establish their roots, and how they identify. Everyone can relate to this film in some way. I hope that's the hope. I just want someone to leave the film with a different outlook, or at least a new question that they can reflect on, for however long they feel necessary.
Yeah, that was actually my next question, was about, key takeaways, and how, maybe to ask the question this way, how do you hope the world is different, because of this film? You already mentioned, being able to kind of return people to the humanity, of one another, and see not just the differences, although differences do matter, but the sameness, that we're all kind of looking for belonging, connection, and community. So that to me is a very obvious. Are there others, key takeaways or lessons that you hope folks take from seeing Proper Pronouns?
I would love, as would Manny, and it was something that we learned through the course of making the film, that people have to realize and get away from the silos that we put people in. Everybody is comfortable with a silo, right? We want somebody identified as a white female. We want someone identified, as a person of color. And, it blows my mind that we can't just look beyond skin color and body parts. And I just want people to walk away realizing and looking at people's souls, and what makes them happy, and what makes them laugh, and what's important to them in life, and why do they challenge belief systems. And, I think about other cultures and other countries, they are never identified as the social construct of race. We created that, that is a creation that just, I hope people come away with the fact that we don't need it. And it's, ironic that this film came out when it did, with, Black Lives Matter and a lot of the trans movements that we have seen making some strides. The Methodist Church, when at the making of this film, they were thinking about breaking off, and because they don't want to be a part of that silo anymore as far as religion goes. And then there's that whole component of, the religious facet of, okay, like Diana says, what do you do and where do you go to church? Well, when I get asked that question down south, I'm saying, I'm a big fan of evolution, so I don't even know how to have this conversation with you. I respect anybody's religious beliefs because that's what I'm supposed to do, because that's how you respect a human being. And that's what I've learned. And like I said, I don't cringe anymore when I go into churches, because they taught me scripture in a totally different way, and how to look at it, and about the eunuchs. I never knew any of that stuff because Catholicism doesn't embrace that. And I just want people to walk away with considering not putting people, including themselves, into silos, because that's the social construct of race, religion, and definitions that of human beings that just, we don't need them. They're exhausting.
Yeah, no, I think that one thing you do really well.
Sorry, I got it. The sun keeps moving and hitting me in the face. Okay, start over. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, one thing I think that Proper Pronouns does so well is uh, show without necessarily explicitly having to tell us that one, the South can be different than some of these stereotypes that people may have about us and where we live. I know there is, of course, Confederate flag imagery that we do see in the film because that is a part of some of the geographies you're shooting. But we get introduced to these four people and their four families and hear about the way that they have been able to maintain Southern identity in a progressive and inclusive way. The second stereotype I feel like the film is able to challenge is this idea that all religious expressions are conservative, regressive, antiquated, and we see the Metropolitan Community Church, we see the United Church of Christ, and we see the Alliance of Baptist traditions represented in the film, which have all had these open and affirming postures, not just toward queer and trans people, but also in terms of coming in solidarity with racial justice and various other progressive movements. And so that to me is also very cool. And then the third film does, and this is another just big personal thank you, and something I think audiences will appreciate as well, is that to the extent that Christianity and trans and gender diversity have often been depicted, we see vitriol. Because, of course, that is true. We see toxic expressions of Christian theology wielded against trans communities. And to the extent that that is not true, it's still rooted in compassion, benevolence, pity. But we get to meet four trans people who are not just recipients of Christian ministry, they are the ministers themselves. And so it inverts sort of that power imbalance and demonstrates the power, the talent, the giftedness that we bring to the church, that we are participating as a gift, to our communities because of these experiences. And so I think that is just another note for fellow filmmakers, is that it is possible to both represent the stark realities that a marginalized community is facing and still tell a story of resilience, to tell a story of empowerment, and to tell a story of what is possible, through the acceptance, inclusion, and intentional pursuit, of justice in the world. So thank you for doing that. I guess.
Well, thank you. I just, as a trans, one of the most important audiences to me is the trans community. They're the ones that I seek approval from. They're the ones that I want to be sure that we did justice to, the story. And I have to make sure everyone know, Manny Robinson being my co-producer and co-editor, he's a phenomenal editor. We had one cut for this for thesis graduation requirements, and he did an amazing job. I shot 95% of the film, and then he did a really great job of bringing in the subtleties, like the Confederate flag, where it's in your face but it's not. We juxtaposed it with Liam saying, sometimes people make it home, but not always. And then we pan to the Confederate flag because we have to remind people where we are, and where they are. But also, we didn't have enough of Michael and Deborah in the film as of May 2019 because they came to the project late. And I continued filming them. I gave myself 2 weeks off, and in June picked up the camera again because they had to be in the film, just as equally as the other two, because trans people of color struggle so much more so. And, just the bravery that those two have, getting up in the morning and leaving the house and driving down the street, as we all know, the era that we're living in, they fear for their lives leaving the house. And they needed to have they needed to be at the forefront of the film. And so then I finished cutting it by myself until January of 2020, because Manny was finishing writing a book. Yeah, because he was a journalist for a newspaper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
wow. Yeah, no, I think that, again, all of the different considerations you made are such a huge part of what it means to do this well, and sort of the spirit of justice and equity. And so I, again, just hope that other folks who see this film and see this, conversation, our audience here kind of takes that into, their work and what they're creating and putting out into the world. We are coming to the end of our time here. I'm wondering if there are any last kind of highlights for you as a filmmaker, maybe another lesson you learned, or something that just personally meant a lot to you, as you were making the film, and especially once you were able to release it out into the world. Just a final reflection.
I think one of the things that I never dreamed it would go where it went. We all have these hopes as filmmakers when you do social justice work in the film industry. We all hope it goes somewhere. But man, being picked up by Hot Springs Documentary Film Festival, and now, the Southern Circuit, and it just is something where we worked really, really hard, but the industry is so, so competitive that when we think about it, and all the tears that I shed trying to put together a film that did properly represent, to the best of my ability as a white cis woman who is not a part of the trans community, I'm just so overjoyed for the ministers that their story is getting out there. PBS North Carolina picked it up, and so just reflecting on, man, we did it. The other thing too that I just reflect on, and just, I've touched on it. I just hope that people can now look at people with a sense of sameness, versus difference. And that comes across in a lot of social justice films when you're talking about race and identity and humanity, and just that people come away with a sense of compassion for people in general, regardless of what community he, she, they belongs to. And just the wonderful memories that I have to do a bloopers reel. I need to. There are some of the funniest comments. I mean, all four of them are so extremely funny that, we revealed that in the film also, for sure. But there are just some wonderful things that I would love to do an outtakes doc, on them, because it shows even how much more human they are. But also just the love that their partners, Pam and Diana, had for them. It just, that moved me to tears so often when we were filming, that I would just turn off the camera and I couldn't speak. So it's also about supporting one another, during hardship, and trying to be there regardless of how we question or how we don't line up with each other's belief systems. You still just have to somehow find that love for that person and stick by them regardless of what they're going through.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think this is our time. Again, thank you to the audience. Thank you to all of the partners. Thank you to all of the organizations who make these conversations possible. And thank you Megan, for being here and for making this film. And I'm really excited, to see where it goes. Is there any other resources you'd like to lift up just before we close out here, or should we just direct folks to the film's website for that?
I just want to also thank the audience for attending. There may have been people that attended that came in to watch it for certain reasons, and hopefully they left with a different sense of what we were trying to do with the film, but also the trans community. Thank you for being brave enough to step into a film that they may have been very uncomfortable watching. Maybe somebody dragged them there. And thank you for being brave enough to attend. The film website does have a list of resources. It has its own resource page for families. Most importantly, suicide hotline phone numbers for both adults and children and families. The ministers' books, if you want to hear more about their stories. The ministers, all 4 of them, have a book they've now written, and they are also available on the resources page. We do have for 4 organizations and colleges. Our distributor is Video Project. They are an educational nonprofit distribution company located in California, and they have the film available as well. And Canopy recently picked up the film, so that is also an educational online streaming platform.
Great. Yeah, I'm imagining that other folks are going to be asking, how can we share this film? Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited for what's next.